Welcome to the Northeast Kingdom Voice. I'm your host, Scott Wheeler. There are many amazing people in the Northeast Kingdom. Some of them are homegrown, others are transplants to the region. Today's guest is one of the most amazing people. She's done amazing work, and her name is Diana Mara Henry. Welcome to the show.
Thank you, Scott. I'm so happy to be here.
Do you know the first time you came on my show was something totally different?
Yep.
And I hate to say it, when I told Todd, the producer of the show, he says to me, "Do you know she's famous?" And I says, "No." And then I researched your work, and you are quite the photographer. I might write history, but you've recorded a lot of history through the lens of your camera.
I appreciate your noticing that. You know, I tell people photographers write history too. Right. And, you know, that's not something that everyone thinks about doing for a lifetime's work, but that was my work.
So let's just go back and tell people a little bit about you.
Well, I started doing photography in college and worked for was a photographer for the Harvard Crimson, which pretty much kept me in college. So I didn't drop out. So I tell people Harvard was my trade school. And but I majored in government, and so when I got out, I was back in New York, and it was a very exciting time. It was the early 70s, and I got very involved in photographing political movements, campaigns, and you know, the Vietnam veterans against the war. I brought some of those pictures, and then the women's movement, and presidential campaigns, congressional campaigns, and I basically was self-assigned. I would photograph what I thought was important for history.
Right. And you have gained a name for yourself.
Mostly for photographing the women's movement.
Right.
That is my best known work.
Right. Before we go on to show a little bit about a few of your photos, so how did you end up in rural Northeast Kingdom?
Well, I was living in Springfield, Mass,
right.
And I was running a bed and breakfast that I'd started as a way to be at home and work from home while my daughter was growing up. And she grew up and moved away, and I said, that's it, I've had it with housekeeping. And I wanted to just have a more serene lifestyle. And I got on 91 and drove north until I saw next stop Canadian border, and I said, well, I might as well get off here, and so found a little house right in Newport, and
it was just random.
It's worked out great.
Right.
You know?
Because, you know, there's actually a lot of well, you know, what is famous? Well, you know, that's hard to explain because I think we're all famous, at least in our own minds, but there are prominent people here, like Bill the Spaceman Lee. He lives out in Craftsbury from Boston Bruins great. Donald Sutherland, he lives right across the border.
Yeah.
And but I think the one thing about this area, everybody focuses on, so many people focus on the bad, but there's so much good, and I think people, especially prominent people, can come here and just be themselves. They don't have to worry about, you know, anybody bothering them.
I think you're right. I think it's very, you know, for me, it's been a time to really work on my publications and exhibits, and also my research into the history of World War II, which
right.
is my second career.
Right, and I have done that myself for years and years, recording the stories of World War II. You've probably focused, more on the photos?
Well, I started by photographing a concentration camp, and that turned into a 35-year project researching and the survivors of the camp, reading their memoirs, translating, and speaking about them.
I periodically, and I just did this a couple of weeks ago, I call up a famed concentration camp survivor, Eva Kor. I don't know if you've heard of her. She she travels the world,
Yes.
and she lives in Terre Haute, Indiana, and she travels the world preaching forgiveness. And
Nice.
that doesn't mean forgetting. That forgiveness. And she every year she brings 200 or 300 Americans to the concentration camps, because she was a twin, one of Dr. Mangler's twins.
Yeah,
And she's really a huge resource. She's written about her. So if you want to connect with her, I have the connections.
I've concentrated on one camp, and Notzweiler in eastern France.
She was at Auschwitz.
It's not well known, and I don't want to go anywhere else, to tell you the truth. It's just so fascinating and so all absorbing.
So have you done any photography around here? Because I don't know if you're aware, but over the years, especially decades ago, we've had some very prominent local photographer like Harry, and if you've seen any old photos of the area, there's a good chance that they were taken by Harry and Alice Richardson, and without them, we wouldn't they went around. They were people ahead of their time. They went all over northern Vermont taking photos of what people thought was just taking nothing. They were taking photos of streetscapes, and they actively knew they were recording history.
Yeah. Well, a long time ago, in the early 1980s, I photographed one-room schools of Vermont for Earthwatch, and with Peggy Nelson of Middlebury. And so those photographs have been exhibited, and that's not what I brought today.
Right. Okay,
I appreciate the documentary impulse for sure.
So this first photo, what is that's of the Vietnam Veterans Against the War?
Yes. So of course, growing up in the '60s, and I was very aware of the Vietnam War, and so this was a self-assignment. It was at Boston Common. It was Vietnam Veterans Against the War Memorial Day event that went through Lexington and Concord, and then came to Boston Common. So I photographed the whole weekend, but this was the veterans marching into Boston Common, as you can see, with guns raised and so on. I don't think we could do that today. But it was, I actually know the names of the men who are marching are now mostly known to me through the internet. It's amazing, but people have started to identify a lot of people in my photographs. So this was 1971.
So you actually, have you met Ron Kovic from Born on the 4th of July was basically his story, correct?
No, that's not him in the wheelchair, but so many people asked me, is that Ron Kovic?
Right. But you know him though, right?
I looked him up on the internet, and I called him. I think I spent 98 cents for the search, that you can. And I called him, and he was very nice. And he wrote something wonderful about my photographs because, I sent them to him after we talked. And I did later photograph him in Los Angeles at a hunger strike at the VA hospital in Westwood. And he's been a great supporter of my work.
Right.
But it was great when I talked to him, because after we talked, at the end of the conversation, he said, well, I gotta go wash my car. And I was like so happy, that he was doing things like that and having a life.
I've watched Born on the 4th of July many times, and do you get any idea whether that's a accurate representation of his life?
I don't know.
Right.
I don't know.
So, but you grew up during, it was a tough period of time, whether you supported Vietnam or whether you were against Vietnam, because I've had Vietnam veterans on this show several times, and they all have different mindsets on it, but you were able to capture it through the lens of a camera. Did you know you were making history at the time?
Well, I knew I was recording history, and I knew that I deliberately went out to photograph things that I thought other people wouldn't, and that I thought should be recorded. I think we'll see some of those photographs.
And that's the thing is, that's where you and I have a lot in common, because that's the way I do my writing. I try to record things that maybe other people aren't doing, because you will agree that there's a lot of great photographers out there, and you don't want to duplicate their work. You want to find something new.
Right. Absolutely.
Okay, this fella is he looks kind of familiar, but a much younger version, the man who would become President Bill Clinton.
That's right.
What year was that taken?
That's right. So this was taken in 1972 at the Democratic National Convention in Miami Beach. I did not have a press pass for that event, but I met some young men who were working. We were all volunteers for Reliable Source. A publication that just came out during the convention. And we got some press passes. And so the night that George McGovern was selected as the presidential nominee, Bill Clinton and I were standing below the podium listening to McGovern, and I did not know who that young man was. But as a photojournalist, you photograph not only the event in front of you, which was the speakers at the podium, but also you really should turn around and check out what else is happening behind you and on the sides. And to the side was this young man who was looking so enthralled, and I thought, that's really the story of the McGovern campaign. That's the story of our grassroots youth movement that is going to change this country. And, it did, but it took several presidencies to do it.
Now, when you, did it take you a while to, how did you finally figure out who this man was?
Yeah, so people ask me, did you know, were you dating him? So it's like, no. But did I know who he was? No, but I always remembered the photograph. And then someone was researching photographs for a film on Shirley Chisholm, and she was looking at all my photographs from the convention. And she said, that's Bill Clinton. And I'm like, nah. And she's like, yeah. So I sent him the photograph and asked, and an aide called me back, a very young woman. I wasn't at all surprised. And she said, he'll sign it, but it may take a few months. And so I got it back signed, and I sent him one for himself also.
To people listening on radio, I apologize that you can't see the photos, but if you go to Vermont's Northland Journal's website, www.northlandjournal.com, you'll actually be able to also watch the show. And again, it's www.northlandjournal.com. Okay, and here is a photo of another, was this fella, was he the president at the time, President Ronald Reagan?
Yeah, well, good question. This was actually his first presidential primary. It was 1976. He did not win that election.
Right.
He was going to run against Jimmy Carter. And so Reagan did not win that primary, but of course it got him prepped for 1980 when he did become president and win the presidency. This was in New Hampshire, and at the time, as for McGovern, I just called up the campaign and Reagan campaign and said, I want to get on the press bus. I'm a freelance photographer. Do you have an assignment? No, I'm working on spec, which means, I may sell the pictures later. And I traveled around with him for a couple of days, photographing his speaking. And this was a fun moment when he was, well, it looks like he's just being playful, but he apparently has posed before for photographers throwing snowballs. I think my photograph is the best.
So tell me, not politically, but it seems like President Reagan was a pretty decent fella. Did you find him to be a pretty decent fella when you hung out with him?
Well, he seemed very friendly, courteous, and certainly his wife made an impression on me as a very, very hard, steely, and uncompromising person.
Right.
So I would say of the two, I would definitely prefer to spend time with Ronald than with Nancy.
Right.
But I guess she was the power behind the man.
Well,
Yeah.
I've said this many times.
Yeah.
Women are the stronger sex. Is no ifs, ands, or buts
Yeah.
about it. Is, I think some men like to think they are, but I don't think so. If I've said this before, if men,
Yeah.
if all of a sudden God said, men, you will start giving birth,
Yeah.
the human race would go extinct.
That's great. Well, here's another powerful
Yeah,
woman.
now, who's this?
So this is Miss Lillian Carter.
Right.
And this is election night, Plains, Georgia. She's hugging her son, Billy. And Billy was the other son.
The wayward son sometimes.
yeah,
Billy
yeah.
Beer, right?
Yeah, so Billy, actually, he created a label called Billy Beer.
Right.
You know, they were peanut farmers from
Right.
Plains, Georgia. The phone directory, I took a picture of the phone directory from Plains, Georgia. It's not even a double-page spread. So this was election night, and I was spending election night just watching the election through the Miss Lillian's face. You know, I was there at the train station at Plains, Georgia, photographing her, and then when Jimmy was said to have won the election, and it was called for him, everyone jumped up with stripped off their raincoats, and they had their Jimmy won T-shirts underneath, and she hugged Billy, who apparently is not the rube or the bore that he's made out to
Right.
be. They say that he was a great reader, that he had a marvelous library, and so like many people who are, there's a rumor about them, it's often untrue.
Well, that brings up another topic then is you've got to also watch you got to watch historical events unfold. But were you ever, so you were there, but were you ever shocked by what you saw in the media though? Like, in other words, do you think back in the 60s and the 70s, I am a big critic of the press today.
Yeah.
For
sure.
it seems to me like when it comes to presidential races,
Yeah.
that you have one news group cheering for this person, the other, the other bunch cheering for that person. There seems to be no impartiality anymore. Was there ever, did you have respect for the news media when you were covering these events?
Well, I have less respect today, and I'm sometimes ashamed. I'm usually ashamed of what I considered my profession has become, because I was also a reporter, a writing reporter.
I so agree with you.
And the obligation to cover the news is really vanishing, and it's becoming opinion.
Ooh. No,
But
that's-
I saw Bella Abzug maligned. That was a woman who I photographed a great deal, and she was very important in my career. And the news, people went after her dress and her size and her voice and everything that, that powered her and made her so energetic, and they forgot to report on her generosity and her programs and the great legislation that she was able to pass in Congress. So,
Well, we mentioned Jimmy Carter in passing, but did you ever get to meet President Carter?
I did not. I photographed these people.
Right.
That was my role.
Okay, and this is Gloria Steinem.
Oh, so Gloria Steinem is holding baby ERA. And I venture to think that there aren't a lot of pictures of Gloria holding a baby. She never had children of her own. But this was in my role as the official photographer for the first National Women's Conference. And there was a delegate at that conference. It was the first and only national convention federally funded by, for, and about women. Took place in Houston, Texas in 1977. And in 1978, the report to the President, the Congress, and the people of the United States was presented to Jimmy Carter at the White House. And this photograph was taken there. A delegate to the conference had given birth since the conference to baby ERA, a name for the Equal Rights Amendment, and Gloria was giving her a hug. Now, this baby today is the same age that Gloria probably was at that time, and she has children of her own, and she's come to my events and Women's Day speeches and so on, and it's just wonderful to know this baby as an adult woman who is doing great things of her own. She's creating a virtual history museum in Colorado. She has a publishing empire in Colorado and a wonderful family. And, you know, it's a great joy to know the people in my photographs and to keep in touch with them as they grow older like me.
And you mentioned the ERA, and here's
Yes.
another photo of women holding up bras.
Right. So this is a photograph that was on the cover front page of the Village Voice, right after the first National Women's Conference, and the bras actually have the inscription on them, "We didn't burn them." And this is a reference to the protests that had been held at the Miss America contests and Miss Universe contests, at which feminists at the time were trying to make the point that women are not to be defined by their bodies. But this was a celebration for the passage of support for the Equal Rights Amendment at the conference.
Right.
Yep.
And this photo, it looks a bit like the Bread and Puppet Theater, but is it?
Well, this is actually, the puppets are created by Amy Trompeter, who is in Rosendale, New York, in the Catskills. And she does come up to the Bread and Puppet Theater, so I have seen her and her puppets there when they have their big celebrations.
Right.
But the event was actually a march to surround the Pentagon, and it was called the Women's Pentagon Action, 1980. There were enough women and some men there to completely surround that building, which is probably a mile in circumference. And the demonstrators tried to prevent people from going in and out of the building and talking to them about the work that they were doing there.
Right. And you've also taken photos of some famous musicians, including?
Well, I had one of my most extraordinary assignments, and this was a paid assignment, was to photograph James Brown. And so I was on stage with him because the concert was held at Rikers Island, which is a house of detention in New York City. And so the audience was composed exclusively of the prisoners being held at the house of detention. And James Brown put on an amazing concert. And what a thrill to be on stage with James Brown. I think the best time,
You didn't happen
the best
to sing
assignment of my life.
You didn't happen to sing with him, did you?
No, I didn't, but my heart was singing.
What kind of guy was he?
Well, I mean, what an amazing, powerful entertainer, and just really galvanized I think brought out the best in people.
Okay, we have one more photo.
Yep.
And what is that?
Well, this is an avant-garde art festival at the World Trade Center of blessed memory. This is an avant-garde art festival that was taking place there in the foyer. And it's, as you can see, a woman walking a man on a leash as if he was a dog. And it's a playful moment. It's, of course, a social comment on gender relations. But I must say I miss those times when men and women could, be themselves and flirt. And I think flirtation has has disappeared today.
Yeah,
and it's
well,
too
political
bad.
correctness.
This
and-
isn't my idea of flirtation, but I do think that there's going to have to be a little comeback to a time when men and women enjoyed being, themselves and being different and playing.
Yeah, because you don't really know what you're supposed to say and what you're not. We
Yeah.
all know what we're not supposed to say.
Yeah, and
Big-
people in the 70s and 80s, this was around 1980. I mean, some people went too far, of course, but mostly it was fun.
Right,
It was really fun.
right. So, does your career continue? Like, are you still out there photographing historical events?
Well, I'm not photographing historical events, but because this year is the 100th anniversary, for instance, of the women's suffrage, of women getting the
Right.
vote in the United States, so my photographs are being shown in museums. And so the Museum of the City of New York has several of my photographs, and the New York State Museum in Albany. And that's mostly how it's working out. Also, a lot of photographs being used for films. I photographed a lot of the artists on the Lower East Side in New York in the 1980s, and those artists are now reaching prominence and are having films made about them. So my photographs of them are appearing in these films.
So, do you go around to these museums and make guest appearances?
Well, I did go to the Museum of the City of New York. I was very keen to see that exhibit and to go to the opening. Yep, absolutely. And I was invited to the New York State Museum. I speak mostly on International Women's Day events. And so that's when I'm invited to speak and show my work.
I think your work is so great and on multiple levels, but from being a history writer, you know how until your generation of people came along, a lot of times in the newspaper articles, women are relegated to Mrs.
Yes.
Sometimes it's hard to find the name of I can find the woman's
Yeah.
last name, but
Yeah.
sometimes I really have to dig because
Yeah.
they didn't have so much of an identity.
Well, this is really interesting. I didn't bring the photographs today, but if you go on my website,
Okay.
can I mention the name?
Sure.
DianaMaraHenry.com. You'll see photographs of a demonstration at the New York Times for the use of the term Ms. And this was something that Gloria Steinem, started Ms. Magazine about with Patricia Carbine as her co-founder. And it's on every form today. You have a choice, Miss, Mrs., or Ms. And I think people today don't know that term is available, just like Mr., to designate a professional person without going into what their marital status is.
Right.
So the demonstration I photographed at the New York Times was in 1974. And do you know when the New York Times started using the term Ms?
In that year?
1986.
Right, okay.
So it took 12 years for the New York Times to recognize that history had moved on.
You know what's interesting though is I have interviewed older women, I mean
Yeah.
like 80s, 90s and above.
Yes.
They don't, that generation,
Yeah.
they're not so keen on that word, Ms.
Right. Well, maybe they had other battles.
Yeah, and,
But for me, it's very important when that women at least have the possibility in a professional setting to be known like Mr.
Yeah,
for their work.
Yeah, because Mr., that
Yeah.
word has always covered.
Right.
It didn't signify whether you were married or not married.
Right.
I think Ms. only makes sense.
No one knows your personal life unless you want to share it, and women should be offered the same option.
I absolutely. And do you know,
Thank you.
you might not agree,
Yeah.
maybe you will, is people taught you, in the history world, people
Yeah.
often yearn for the good old days.
Yeah.
Well, I warn people about that because the good old days.
Yeah.
Are you talking about when if you stepped on a rusty nail, it might cost you your life?
Right.
Or like the good old days when, like I've talked to men in their 90s who said, or women,
Yeah.
women and men who, the good old days meant that it was very difficult for a woman to leave
Yeah,
a unhealthy relationship.
right.
So I don't necessarily think the good old days were always as good as we like to pretend they
No,
were.
I think we're making progress, and that it's good to think positive sometimes too.
Okay,
Be happy in this beautiful world.
Right. And I, though, would like to ask you, because you mentioned the women's suffrage,
Yeah.
100 years ago.
Yep.
Well, my next book is on the history, the 100th anniversary of Newport, and at the
Excellent.
at the first meeting of of Newport becoming a city
Yes.
on March 5th, 1918, they actually, in brief,
Yeah.
mentioned that they're celebrating the women's suffrage and women getting to vote during
Isn't
that.
that exciting?
During
I've
that
got the chills.
during that election.
Yeah.
How do you've been living through some pretty trying times in
Yeah.
Newport with the political shenanigans and
Mm-hmm.
them trying to get Main Street back to life.
Right.
What is your view of Newport since you live here?
Well, I think, when I moved here, I thought I was very excited. I thought the geographical location was so special.
Right.
And I still find it fascinating as far as the people go, as you mentioned. Not only the famous, but the less famous
Right.
are also very interesting, wonderful people. I've made friends here. People have really given me a very warm welcome. I think there are a lot of problems with the civic management of Newport. And I think there are city councilors who are trying very hard, very well-meaning, and, I wish them a lot of luck, because I think there are also countervailing personalities that are very difficult.
Yeah, I think it was a tough way to end the first
Yeah.
100 years, and I'm really hoping for a brighter chapter, because I tell people all the time is, with all of our, like every place, we have our faults, but I still find that if my car breaks down, it's like I have so many people
Yeah.
stop to ask, "Are you okay? Is there anything we can do?" I still think,
Can I offer my little prescription, since you mentioned
Sure.
it, for Newport? I think the lake is very much underutilized as an asset for Newport. And I think if more piers were put out on the lake and Newport branded itself as being, say, Newport North, like Newport, Rhode Island, as a place for sailing, as a place for water sports, we could have an amazing resurgence for the economy. We could have summer schools for sailing. We could have boat repair, training schools, and there would be a brand. I think Newport needs a brand, and the lake seems to be, like for Magog in Canada.
Right.
The lake would be a really great brand, I think.
And for some reason, Newport or this region doesn't fully embrace its rich history.
Yeah.
I don't think you have to build up on a region's history.
Yeah.
But I think it's great to celebrate it, and but we do have the 100-year
Yeah.
celebration coming up, and I'm
Yep.
hoping that's going to be a success. But I happen to love the fact that we're able to embrace people like you to come here and introduce you
Thank
to
you.
our world, because you could have lived anywhere else.
Yep, no.
But you chose Vermont's Northeast Kingdom.
Yep. Thank you.
I want to thank you for coming on, and
Yeah.
I welcome you to come back on
Yeah,
again.
thank you,
because
Scott.
I just love the people who live here, and that doesn't mean just people like me who've been here since the
Yeah.
glaciers receded. A lot of my good friends are
Yeah.
people who have moved here, because sometimes it takes people from away to realize the richness that we actually have.
Absolutely. I'm so looking forward to your new book.
Right.
Can't wait.
All right. Thank you for coming on.
Thank you. Thank you, Scott.
And thank you to the viewers for tuning in to another segment of the Northeast Kingdom Voice.